February 1944. The Italian campaign had promised a swift path into the heart of Europe, but at Anzio, that promise had soured, curdling into a stagnant, bloody stalemate. Here, on a sliver of reclaimed marshland south of Rome, the Allied army was not advancing. It was trapped. The Anzio beachhead was less a foothold and more a cage, a 37-mile perimeter of mud and misery constantly rattled by the bars of German artillery. For the men on the line, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a waterlogged foxhole. A bone-deep cold, born of the nearby Tyrrhenian Sea, seeped through their uniforms, chilling them in a way no fire could ever warm. Rain was a constant companion, falling in a miserable, unending drizzle that turned the earth into a thick, greedy porridge. This was the Pontine Marshes, a landscape engineered for agriculture, now re-engineered for death. Into this hell came the men of the 1st Special Service Force. They were a unique breed, an elite, hand-picked unit of American and Canadian outdoorsmen, lumberjacks from the Pacific Northwest, miners from Ontario, hunters from the Rockies. They were men accustomed to mountains and forests, masters of vertical warfare who had just clawed their way up the sheer cliffs of Monte la Difensa. But this was a different kind of war. This was flat, featureless, and utterly exposed. Their new home was the far right flank of the beachhead, an 8-mile stretch of indefensible ground anchored by the Mussolini Canal. The canal was a dark, sluggish ribbon of water, a moat separating them from the very best troops Germany could field. Before their arrival, an entire division of 10,000 men had struggled to hold this line. Now it was being handed to just 1,800 of them. It felt less like an assignment and more like a sacrifice. A private from Montana, a man who could track an elk for days through dense timber, now found himself trying to disappear in a shallow ditch. His daily routine was a grim ritual of survival, waking not from sleep but from a shivering stupor, chewing on a cold K ration, the taste of processed meat and damp earth mingling in his mouth, the constant, low-grade tension of listening for the whine of an incoming shell, for the telltale cough of a German patrol, for the dreaded rumble of tank treads. He watched the medics, their uniforms caked in mud and blood, as they carried another still form back from the line. There was no glory here, only the grim calculus of attrition. The men huddled together for warmth, their faces gaunt, their eyes reflecting the endless gray sky. They were warriors, forged in the harshest training imaginable. But here, their primary enemy was not the German soldier. It was the cold, the wet, and the gnawing sense of hopelessness. Across the canal, they could feel the enemy gathering. Elite Panzer Grenadiers, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, and elements of the formidable Hermann Göring Panzer Division. They were massing for a final, decisive push, an offensive everyone knew was coming. The whispers in the trenches were of an attack that would drive the Allies back into the sea, of an annihilation that felt not just possible, but inevitable. The men of the force were being asked to stand on the very edge of the abyss, to hold the line where an army had failed, and to stare down the storm that was about to break. In a damp, sandbagged command post, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and stale coffee. Maps, stained with mud and marked with grim red circles, lay spread across a makeshift table under the weak glow of a single lantern. Here, in the nerve center of the 1st Special Service Force, Colonel Robert T. Frederick stared at the impossible arithmetic of his situation. 8 miles of front, 1,800 men, and across a sluggish, dark canal, the massing might of the German 14th Army. The reports from his first reconnaissance patrols confirmed his worst fears. They weren't just facing standard infantry. They were facing elite, battle-hardened units, supported by a weight of artillery that could pulverize their shallow defenses in a matter of hours. Every instinct, every lesson from West Point screamed that his position was untenable. A passive defense, huddled in waterlogged foxholes, was not a strategy. It was a death sentence delivered on a timetable of the enemy's choosing. Frederick was a commander who led from the front, a man who had bled with his soldiers on the frozen peaks of the Italian mountains. He knew them not as numbers on a roster, but as individuals. He thought of the quiet confidence of the Montana trapper, the raw strength of the Ontario miner, the sharp eyes of the Quebecois hunter. These were not men bred for static trench warfare. They were predators, masters of stealth and surprise, whose skills were being utterly wasted in a defensive crouch. To use them as conventional line infantry was to use a finely honed stiletto as a bludgeon. It was inefficient, it was wasteful, and it would get them all killed. The lantern light flickered across his face, illuminating a sudden, hard clarity in his eyes. The answer was not in the field manuals. It was in the very nature of the men he commanded. He would not wait for the enemy's storm. He would become the storm himself. He summoned his company commanders, men with faces etched by fatigue and the biting cold. They gathered around the map, their expressions grim, expecting orders to dig in deeper, to prepare for the inevitable onslaught. They expected a speech about holding the line to the last man. Frederick let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of their predicament settle upon them all. Then he spoke, his voice low but cutting through the tension. He told them that waiting was suicide. He gestured to the map, to the overwhelming concentration of German forces. They were planning a knockout blow, an attack designed to shatter their line and collapse the entire beachhead. The Germans, he explained, saw them as a minor obstacle, a thin screen to be brushed aside. And in that underestimation, Frederick saw his opening. He laid out a new strategy, a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. They would not defend, they would attack. Not in a grand, daylight assault, but in the dead of night. They would cede the day to the German artillery, but they would seize the darkness for themselves. The Mussolini Canal would not be their last line of defense. It would be their highway into the enemy's heart. The objective was not to take and hold ground. The objective was terror. Small, hand-picked patrols would slip across the water every single night. They would move like ghosts through the German lines, armed with sharpened knives and muffled carbines. They would strike outposts, eliminate sentries, sabotage equipment, and vanish before the enemy even knew what had hit them. He wanted to sow chaos and paranoia to make every shadow a source of fear. A heavy silence fell over the command post. His officers exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the war they had been trained to fight. It was a brutal, personal, and terrifyingly intimate form of combat. One captain finally spoke, his voice hesitant, questioning the immense risk of sending small groups of men deep into a numerically superior enemy's territory without support. Frederick met his gaze. He explained that their support would be the darkness itself. Their greatest weapon would not be the machine gun, but the enemy's own imagination. They would create a legend, a phantom menace that haunted the German front lines. He described how his men would blacken their faces with boot polish, how the V-42 stiletto was designed for this exact purpose, silent, lethal, and psychologically devastating. He wasn't just asking them to kill the enemy, he was asking them to break their minds. He was betting everything on the unique skills of his men and the sheer, primal fear they could inspire. The doubt in the room began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning resolve. They had followed this man up sheer cliffs under machine gun fire. They trusted him. If he believed this was their only path to survival, then they would walk it. The decision was made. The war for the Mussolini Canal would not be fought with artillery barrages, but with whispers and shadows. The plan was set. A strategy born of desperation and genius was about to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting enemy. To witness how these nocturnal raids transformed the battlefield, shattered the morale of elite SS divisions, and forged the legend of the Black Devils, make sure you subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. You will not want to miss the storm that is about to break over Anzio. The transformation began not with a bugle's call, but with a whisper in the dark. It started with the simple, grimy ritual of preparation. In dripping dugouts, hidden from the prying eyes of German spotter planes, men of the force gathered around flickering lanterns. Their faces, already gaunt from the cold and the rations, were about to become instruments of war. They used tins of boot polish, a common soldier's tool for maintaining leather, now repurposed for a far more sinister task. The black, greasy paste was smeared across cheeks, foreheads, and hands, erasing their humanity and turning them into nocturnal predators. The polish filled the lines of fatigue around their eyes, creating hollow masks that would reflect no light, only fear. Then came the knives. The V-42 stiletto was not a brawling weapon. It was an instrument of anatomical precision. Men would run a thumb along the needle-sharp point, a quiet, personal moment of focus before stepping into the abyss. Each man checked his gear with the meticulous care of a surgeon. Muffled carbines, pockets filled with extra magazines, grenades taped to prevent rattling, and the small paper stickers that would become their terrifying calling card. The first patrols were tentative, exploratory probes into a hornet's nest. Small teams of 3 or 4 men would slide into the icy, brackish water of the Mussolini Canal. The shock of the cold was absolute, a brutal jolt that stole the breath and threatened to cramp every muscle. They moved with a swimmer's grace, holding their weapons high, their only sound the gentle lapping of water against their chests. On the far bank they melted into the reeds and shadows, becoming one with the desolate landscape. A German sentry, a young man from Bavaria huddled in a greatcoat, might stamp his feet to ward off the damp chill. He would hear a rustle in the reeds, dismiss it as a rat, and turn his gaze back toward the canal. That momentary lapse in concentration was his last. There was no struggle, no cry for help. A hand would clamp over his mouth from behind, pulling his head back to expose the throat. The V-42 would do its work with a silent, devastating efficiency. The forceman would hold the body for a moment, letting life drain away, before gently lowering it into the muddy ditch. A single paper sticker, its red arrowhead, a stark contrast to the drab uniform, was pressed onto the dead man's helmet. The worst is yet to come. The next morning, the discovery would send a ripple of unease through the German lines. One man gone, a strange sticker left behind. It was unsettling, but perhaps an isolated incident, the work of a lone, daring partisan. The German commanders dismissed it. This was a sideshow. The real war would be fought with artillery and panzers. But the next night, it happened again, and again. Not just one sentry, but an entire 2-man listening post. They were found at dawn, slumped over their MG-42, their watch synchronized and still ticking. No shots had been fired. No alarm had been raised. They had simply been erased from existence in the middle of their watch. The stickers were there, a mocking promise. Colonel Frederick's strategy was one of deliberate, terrifying escalation. The initial pinprick raids proved the concept. Now he would begin to bleed the enemy. The patrols grew in size and ambition. They were no longer just eliminating sentries. They were hunting. They moved with the inherited knowledge of their civilian lives, the trapper's sense of terrain, the hunter's instinct for the stalk. One patrol, led by a sergeant who had guided hunting parties in the Rockies, found the telltale signs of a German command post. A buried communications wire, a faint trail of boot prints, more heavily used than others. They spent hours in the freezing mud, observing, sketching the layout, noting the guard rotation. They were patient predators, and their patience would be rewarded. They struck an hour before dawn, when human vigilance is at its lowest ebb. 4 men dealt with the perimeter guards while the main element stormed the dugout itself. The door was kicked in, and the dim interior was filled with the short, sharp cough of suppressed carbines. It was over in seconds. The German company commander and his radio operator died before they could even rise from their maps. Before melting back into the darkness, the forceman left a sticker on the radio set, a final, chilling message for whoever found the scene. The reports reaching General Oberst von Mackensen's headquarters became increasingly bizarre and alarming. His frontline officers, veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, spoke of ghosts and phantoms. They described patrols that went out and never returned, of men found dead with inexplicable wounds. They spoke of a pervasive, creeping fear that was doing more damage than any artillery shell. Von Mackensen, a man of cold Prussian logic, was incensed. He saw the battlefield in terms of divisions and logistics, of armor and air power. This talk of devils was an insult to the discipline of the German soldier. He accused his commanders of cowardice and hysteria. He ordered them to double the patrols, to string tripwires and set up flares, to sweep the canal banks with machine gun fire at random intervals. These measures only made things worse. The forcemen were masters of their environment. They found the tripwires and cut them, leaving the ends carefully placed to look undisturbed. The random machine gun fire merely served as a guide, outlining German positions for future raids. The flares, intended to expose the attackers, became their greatest asset. A forceman from Ontario, a miner accustomed to absolute darkness, would freeze the moment a flare popped, becoming as still as a stone. The brilliant, magnesium-white light would wash over the landscape, revealing nothing but mud and shattered trees. When the flare died, plunging the world back into an even deeper blackness, he would move, covering 20 yards before the enemy's night vision could readjust. The Germans were illuminating their own demise. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers began to see shadows move where there were none. Every snap of a twig, Every whisper of the wind was a harbinger of a silent, steely death. They started finding the V-42 wounds on their comrades. The medics were baffled and horrified. The thin blade left a puncture that was nearly impossible to stitch closed, causing massive internal bleeding. Rumors spread like a contagion. The Americans had a special knife, a ghost knife, that killed without a sound and left a wound that could not be healed. The cohesion of the elite Panzer Grenadier units began to fray. Men who would charge headlong into a machine gun nest now refused to take up night sentry duty. Fights broke out. Officers had to threaten courts-martial to get their men to move out into the darkness. The front line opposite the Mussolini Canal was no longer a military position. It was a haunted house, 8 miles long. The raids became bolder still. Combat patrols, 50 or 60 strong, now crossed the canal to hit hardened targets. They bypassed the terrified front line and struck deep, targeting mortar pits, supply dumps, and artillery positions. They used plastic explosives to destroy equipment, creating chaos and confusion far behind the lines, then fought their way back, using the enemy's own panic as cover. In one such raid, a forceman cornered a German officer in a bunker. The man surrendered, begging for his life. In the grim calculus of these nocturnal operations, prisoners were a liability. They were noisy, they slowed you down, and they could alert other units. The forceman simply looked at the terrified officer and said, "We don't take prisoners tonight." This brutal mentality was not born of malice, but of a desperate, cold-blooded necessity. It was a message that spread rapidly through the German ranks. To encounter the phantoms in the night was a death sentence. The apex of this campaign of terror was not a single grand battle, but a small, intimate discovery. A German lieutenant, killed during a daylight probe, was found to have a diary in his tunic. A forceman, fluent in German, leafed through the pages back at the command post. The final entries were a testament to the success of Frederick's strategy. The lieutenant wrote of the cold, the mud, and the constant shelling, but mostly he wrote of the night. He described the feeling of being watched, the stories of men vanishing, the sheer, unnerving silence that was more frightening than any bombardment. His last entry, scrawled with a shaky hand, gave a name to the nameless dread that had consumed his unit. He wrote, "Die Schwarzen Teufel sind überall." The black devils are all around us. We cannot even bury our dead. The phrase was electric. It was a confirmation, from the enemy's own hand, of the legend they had forged in mud and darkness. Colonel Frederick had the entry copied and distributed. The men seized upon the name. It was a badge of honor, a title earned in the most brutal form of warfare imaginable. They were no longer just the 1st Special Service Force. They were the Black Devils. And their work was far from over. The German High Command was about to learn just how much damage a handful of devils could do to the grand designs of an entire army. The fear that had been planted in the darkness began to bear its bitter fruit in the cold light of day. For General Oberst von Mackensen, the reports from the front line along the Mussolini Canal no longer sounded like military dispatches. They read like pages from a Gothic horror novel. His elite SS and Panzer Grenadier troops, men who had faced the endless hordes of the Red Army, were now refusing to go on night patrol. A deep and corrosive paranoia had settled over the German lines. Every shadow held a phantom. Every rustle of the wind was the sound of an approaching stiletto. The 8-mile sector that was supposed to be the launching pad for his grand offensive had become a psychological dead zone, a place where the discipline and courage of the German soldier simply evaporated after sunset. The Black Devils had not just seized the night, they had poisoned it. Von Mackensen, a creature of logic and order, could not comprehend this. He saw a thin screen of commandos, a mere 1,800 men, and could not reconcile that number with the chaos they were causing. He raged at his commanders, accusing them of cowardice, but his anger could not mend the shattered nerves of his frontline soldiers. The right flank of the Anzio beachhead, intended to be the weak point to be smashed open, had become an impenetrable fortress, built not of concrete and steel, but of pure primal terror. The grand plan, Operation Fishfang, was predicated on precision and overwhelming force applied simultaneously across the front, but the timetable was now in shambles. Crack units that were supposed to be spearheading the main assault had to be diverted to the canal, tasked with the impossible mission of hunting ghosts in the dark. These diversions fatally weakened the main thrust of the offensive before it even began. When the assault finally came, It was not the coordinated thunderclap von Mackensen had envisioned. It was a disjointed, hesitant push. In other sectors, the Germans met with brutal but conventional resistance. But against the Mussolini Canal, the attack faltered before it truly started. The German soldiers, who had spent weeks listening to their comrades vanish into the night, advanced with the trepidation of men walking to their own execution. The forcemen met them not with a static wall of fire, but with the same fluid, deadly tactics they had perfected in the darkness. They allowed the initial wave to cross the canal, channeling them into pre-sighted killing zones. Johnson LMGs and M1 carbines opened up from unseen positions, cutting the attackers down. The Germans, already psychologically broken, had no stomach for this fight. The attack on the right flank collapsed into a bloody and disorganized retreat. The failure of Operation Fishfang was catastrophic. It was the German 14th Army's last, best chance to destroy the Anzio beachhead, and it had been broken. The abscess would not be cleansed, and the men who had held the most critical line, who had turned the tide through sheer audacity, were not content to simply defend. Their war was a war of movement, and they had been still for far too long. As spring turned to summer in May of 1944, the tide of the entire Italian campaign turned. The Allies were no longer trapped. They were ready to break out, to push north and seize the prize that had eluded them for so long: Rome. When the order came to advance, it was no surprise who was chosen to lead the charge. The 1st Special Service Force, the Black Devils, were unleashed. They moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned the reeling German defenders. The skills honed in the nocturnal terror of the canal were now applied to a lightning advance. They were the tip of the Allied spear, and on June 4, 1944, they achieved what had once seemed impossible. Men from Montana and Ontario, lumberjacks and miners, became the first Allied soldiers to enter the Eternal City. They had not only saved the beachhead, they had opened the road to Rome. Their victory was written in the cold, hard language of numbers. During their 99 days at Anzio, the force of 1,800 men suffered over 400 casualties, but they had inflicted a staggering toll on the enemy. It is estimated they killed and wounded thousands of German soldiers, captured hundreds more in daylight operations, and completely shattered the morale of at least 3 enemy divisions. They had fought a private war and won a strategic victory. The legend of the Black Devils echoed far beyond the muddy fields of Anzio. The story of their unconventional tactics, of the blackened faces and the chilling calling cards, became a foundational text for a new kind of warfare. The principles of psychological operations, of using a small, elite force to achieve a disproportionate effect, would become the cornerstone of Special Forces doctrine for generations to come. From the snow-capped mountains of Afghanistan to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, the spirit of the 1st Special Service Force would live on. The U.S. Army's Green Berets and Canada's Joint Task Force 2 both trace their lineage directly back to these men, to the audacious idea that the most potent weapon on any battlefield is not the cannon, but the human mind. The story of the Black Devils at Anzio is more than just a tale of a single battle. It is a timeless lesson in the nature of conflict itself. It proves that brute force can be defeated by ingenuity, that overwhelming numbers can be paralyzed by audacious courage, and that a legend, once forged in the crucible of combat, can become a weapon more powerful than any steel. They were asked to hold an impossible line, and they did so not by digging in, but by reaching out into the darkness and making the enemy fear the very idea of them. They were not just soldiers, they were an idea, a terrifying whisper in the night that turned the tide of a war.